Hi there. So, welcome to the first themed topic of discussion. The theme of this video has to do with structure and the importance, meaning of structure. So, I'm sure that many of you have received the advice of trying to continue with your everyday activities as best you can. And to a large degree, I think that is very useful and valuable advice. So, one of the things that I have found interesting observing people's reactions is how, when they are forced by their conditions to relinquish the normal everyday rituals and practices that they have grown used to, there is a type of, well, technically a decompensation, but a type of regression. Now, in our society, we make space for this kind of controlled regression, and we usually have this in short bursts over things like weekends, and then longer bursts in the form of holidays. And I think it is not surprising that, at least initially, a whole bunch of people reacted to the self-isolation practices as a type of holiday. Not everyone, of course. For some people, they were in the grips of remarkable levels of anxiety and despair. But I think for a large part of at least our population, it was seen as a welcome break from work. At the same time, for some people, the the absence of the structures and the rituals of their lives in itself becomes a source of stress. So we are hardly aware of how much containment we experience through the different rituals and practices that we engage in day by day, week by week. Just the notion of something like a work week and a weekend, a fairly arbitrary kind of structuring of time, falls away under certain circumstances because we don't have the rituals that we might associate with work and with weekend. So in this country, there's usually a 5 or a 6 day work week, Monday to Friday, Monday to Saturday, where the person knows, they are going to work. So they get up, they get dressed, they drive a certain route, they have certain rituals at the office, they see very similar things happening along the way, they tend to meet the same kind of people, and there is, while not perfect, a certain kind of comfort in that predictability and that replicability. Then comes something like the weekend, and for some people, there will be a predictable kind of weekend structure as well. Maybe it will be social, having some kind of get together, or it will be maybe something related to sport, either watching or participating in sport or exercise or some form of practice, something that they generally regard as not having time for in the week, or maybe it's not appropriate to do in the week. But we structure time, or time structures us, I think is maybe a more useful way to think about that. And when that falls away, even if we still have this notion of time, the things that announce that today is a weekend day or today is a work day, the, the, the anchors that remind us of that division fall away. For some people, of course, they are not able to work from home, and that means that the need to always be on top of whether it's a work day or a weekend day also falls away. So that containment that we experience disappears little by little, or in the case of the enforced lockdown, sometimes quite abruptly. Maybe I should just say something a little bit about containment. So, containment is, as the word suggests, it is like a container in which you would pour something or hold something, and whatever you pour into that container will assume the shape of that container. So that's the literal definition. Psychologically, like I suggested, the division of something like time into work days or non-work days or holidays become a kind of psychological container. So that when it's a work day, if it's defined as such, there are certain things that we would expect of ourselves and of other people. In the absence of that definition, one would, of course, if you didn't know what kind of day it was, you could pay attention to the people around you, and other people's activities and ways of responding would suggest to you what kind of day it is. Now, I'm using time here as an example of structure, and it's certainly not the only structure that we have or way of structuring ourselves. So, in the absence of that psychological containment, we tend to regress. We become less driven for some. For some, we become more anxious because we are not always sure how to structure the next moment. So, as the practical suggestions go, try to maintain a similar kind of routine. Now, of course, in a time of pandemic, in a time of self-isolation and so on, for most of us, routines certainly don't look the same anymore. So where in the past on a Monday I would go into office and have my first patient at 8 o'clock in the morning, while I might still communicate with that patient tomorrow morning, tomorrow is Monday, I won't be going into the office, and my patient won't be in a setting like my office. They will be at home or maybe at work. So it suddenly becomes different. So even if we maintain a routine, the differentness is inevitable. So while it's a good idea to try and stick to something familiar of the routine, it is also so that there will inevitably be elements that will prove to be quite different. There are certain routines that one certainly just would not be able to replicate. So if you, every evening or maybe on a Friday evening, you were likely to go out to the pub and to have a few drinks with friends, at least at this moment in our history, in this point of time, in this country at least, that's not allowed, so that's not going to happen. Now, of course, you can have a virtual get-together, but there are so many subtle things that's present in the actual situation where we would have a get-together that it certainly won't feel the same. And these are subtle elements, and I can anticipate that there will be a chorus of people who really deny the importance of those things. And okay, maybe for them those things aren't important. But I think we have a general misunderstanding of how the subtle elements influence us on a daily basis. So, I think it is important to, when thinking about structure or routines, to maybe return to one's sense of values. So, to the degree that it's possible for you to follow the same kind of routine, please do so. As long as that routine, of course, is useful and leads to meaningful or practically relevant outcomes. But in the absence of those parts of the routine that we can't replicate or replicate in a satisfactory way, what are the things that are important to you? So, people will, for instance, and again, as a practical suggestion, it's certainly not a bad idea, would suggest something like daily or regular exercise. Good idea. If you did not have a regular routine of exercise, this may not sit well with you or may not be the most obvious thing for you to consider. Still, not a bad idea to consider it. But if it was absent from your life previously, well, there are, I suppose, two broad ways to think about that. Either it was never, that way of practicing physical health was never part of your world or part of your value set, or you were living a life that was predicated on values imposed on you. Okay, now I'm not going to get into that too much, but I think it is important to try and do things that do fit into your own existing values. So, what are the things that are important to you? Is family and connection important to you? Are friends, social experiences important to you? If so, one would have to deliberately think of ways to express that particular value and then to, at least in the absence of, shall we say, normal structure. There's a tricky concept, but in the absence of that normal or usual structure, one would then have to find ways to deliberately make it more routine or part of your routine to practice that value in some form. And for some people, it is enough to send a message. For some people, it will be enough to post a video. For some people, it will have to involve a conversation. All right, so that's one thing. So, what is important? For some people, it will be something like spirituality. So, perhaps a particular form of practicing religion or some other form of spiritual practice. Again, for a lot of people, that would have been part of their routine. They might go to church on Sunday, or they may listen to a religious podcast, or they may do reading from scripture or something like that. Now, of course, some of those things will not be possible. So, at the moment, going to church is not allowed because of the risk that is associated with that. So that falls away. But the routine, the expression of that particular value of spirituality, I think, then becomes the guiding light, and then one has to try and replicate that in some meaningful way. All right. So structure serves as a type of container for us, and the absence of the very many unseen containment elements of routine in itself can become stressful. So do try to think about the most important ways of establishing routine and structure, and to the degree that it is useful, meaningful, safe, look towards your values and try to create routines around your values. One of the unforeseen results of a situation like the one we find ourselves in at the moment will be that a lot of people will discover that the lives they have been living did not satisfy their own values, and when left to their own devices, they might actually find more meaningful ways of engaging with everyday life. That may cause its own kind of crisis, but of course, it may also create its own kind of opportunity. I hope that this has been useful. I hope that it can provoke some thought, and I am eagerly waiting to hear what your feedback or ideas might be. I hope that you are safe and healthy, and we'll speak again soon. Bye bye.